Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for bearing with us, and welcome to the second plenary of the day. My name is Richard Harries. I'm the Associate Director for the Institute for Community Studies, and we're delighted to be working in partnership with Local Trust and the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research at Sheffield Hallam University today. For those of you who haven't come across the Institute before, we're a new type of research institute, part of the Young Foundation, with people and communities at our heart. We seek to create structures and approaches that allow people and local communities to be equal partners in a shared endeavour around how knowledge is produced, how evidence is prioritised, and how policy is created. And I'm particularly pleased to be coming on now directly after Andy Burnham's really inspirational speech just then. I mean, he really sort of set a clear agenda for what levelling up could look like in Manchester, fixing the foundations and fixing the finance and really making the place better. And of course, we also heard Andy Haldane this morning talking about the need for really better data at the local and hyperlocal level. And our session this afternoon is going to take a critical look at what we know about left behind neighbourhoods. Where are they? What's the connection between social deprivation and economic performance? How can we unpick cause and effect? And how can we exploit more granular data to get a rich insight into life at the hyperlocal level in the way that Andy Haldane was suggesting? And joining me here on the stage in Manchester is Sarah Allen, Deputy Director for Civil Society Strategy and Analysis at the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And down the line, we've got Stefan Noble, Director and Head of Research at OXI, the Oxford Consultants for Social Inclusion. And from the Office for National Statistics, Donna Leong, Director of Economic Statistics Change, and Emma Hickman, Deputy Director for Subnational Statistics and Analysis. And we're going to be hearing from each of our panellists over the next half hour, God willing and technology permitting, before handing over to you for your questions to them. And I'm going to be applying a very strict 10-minute rule on all of our speakers so there is enough time for you to talk. So with that in mind, let's go to Stefan first up, who will talk to us about the Community Needs Index and what it tells us about left behind areas. Stefan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can I just check audio? Am I coming out in the room? Can you all hear okay without echoes and horrible things?
We can hear you.
Lovely, fabulous. Okay, let me just share screen. Today, I'm going to give you an overview of a piece of research we've been working on with Local Trust to develop a quantitative, evidence-based definition of left behind areas in order to examine some of the specific socioeconomic challenges experienced by people living in these areas. So left behind areas are conceptualised in this research as areas that experience the dual disadvantage of both high levels of need, multiple deprivation, and socioeconomic challenges on the one hand. So the focus on these specific community and social challenges, in addition to deprivation, arose from conversations Local Trusts were having in the big local areas where they worked, where residents were consistently identifying a lack of spaces to meet and poor connectivity as key priority issues, while an active and engaged community was seen as a necessary key ingredient to help affect meaningful change and address the challenges they were facing. In response to these priorities, we developed a community needs index, which gathers together quantitative spatial data to measure the relative community strength and social infrastructure across wards in England. It's different from, say, the index of multiple deprivation, as it's not so much about the presence of some of the bad stuff, the unemployment, the crime, the ill health, or wider economic deprivation challenges. It's more about the absence of some of the good stuff, the strong third sector and civic assets that support the social fabric of the place. The index was developed at ward level, as it was important for us to look at below local authority level data, the granular data, in order to capture some of the variation in need across local neighbourhoods and uncover hidden concentrations of need. Wards have the advantage of generally being a meaningful and recognised geography for a local community. Their boundaries are traditionally centred around established neighbourhoods, and people are normally aware of the wards they're located in through engagement with the political process, for example, through voting in council elections or through dialogue with local councillors. Having established the geographical unit of analysis, we then identified a long list of 59 indicators which provided local data on social infrastructure challenges. These are drawn from quite a wide range of sources, including data from government departments, data from third sector organisations and commercial organisations, and included a mix of administrative and survey data published at a range of geographical levels. In order to be included in the final set of indicators, they needed to satisfy a series of tests. So indicators needed to have a full national coverage and be collected at a consistent basis nationally. They should be available at sufficient granularity down to a sub-local authority level in order to be able to make meaningful comparisons across the wards, whilst ensuring at the same time that they were non-disclosive and abided by conditions of data protection. They needs to represent the most up-to-date measure of this particular theme, as well as being relevant to the dimensions of community need we were trying to capture. It's also important that the indicators didn't have any skewed distribution, such as large numbers of zeros or suppressed values or large numbers of 100% values, which would distort any kind of composite measure we were creating. We wanted to use open data so that the underlying methodology is transparent and the underlying data is shareable. We wanted to avoid any double counting in what we were measuring, as well as excluding any indications that were used in the index of multiple deprivation, as our intention was to combine those two metrics together. And we went through a series of consultations with our advisory group of key stakeholders in order to refine the list of indicators and also to identify any indicators that we weren't previously aware of. These indicators were then organised into 3 domains: civic assets, connectedness, and an active and engaged community, all aimed at addressing different dimensions of community need. And I'm now going to run you through each of the indicators in the domains at a very high level. So the first domain is civic assets. This measures the presence of key community, civic, educational and cultural assets in the area. These include things like youth clubs, libraries, public parks, community centres, places of worship, village halls or community owned assets. Generally facilities that provide things to do and spaces to meet, often at little or no cost, which are important to how positive a community feels about its area. The majority of these indicators are drawn from Ordnance Survey's address-based database, which provides a comprehensive database of property and land by specific category. We identified areas as containing an asset, a community asset, if the asset fell within the ward or within 1 kilometre of the ward boundary, to allow for the fact that people access facilities outside of their immediate neighbourhood. The second domain was connectedness, which measures connectivity both in physical terms, so how easy it is to access key services such as health services, connectivity in terms of digital connectivity, social connectivity with measure of loneliness, and access to public and private transports. It also looks at how strong the local jobs market is. There are 5 indicators included in this domain: a travel time to key services by walking in public transport to capture physical connectivity and public transport provision, a measure of car ownership from the census, a measure of jobs density, a composite measure of loneliness, which mixes both self-reported levels of loneliness and data on prescriptions for loneliness-related medical conditions, a measure of digital infrastructure in the form of broadband speed to capture the increasing importance of online social interactions and transactions as well. The final domain was active and engaged community, which measures levels of active participation in community and civic life, as well as the strength of the third sector locally, bringing in administrative data on grant recipients from 360 Giving, third sector organisations from Charity Base, and modelled data on volunteering, cultural and civic and sporting participation, perceptions of neighbourliness and strength of social relationships from key national surveys such as the Community Life Survey, as well as data on variations in voter turnout locally. Our research paper, which I've linked in this slide, provides more details of the indicators. The indicators were standardised, weighted and combined into domains, which were themselves standardised, weighted and combined to produce the overall community needs index. For our final definition of left behind areas, we also wanted to make sure we captured some of the broader socioeconomic deprivation factors that weren't covered in the community needs index, such as low income, poor physical health, low educational attainment and crime, all of which can have a significant impact on communities. Our left behind areas measure, therefore, was constructed by combining both the Community Needs Index and the 2019 Index of Multiple Deprivation, which captures some of these broader socioeconomic challenges, with areas identified as left behind if they were ranked among the most deprived 10% of wards in England on both the community needs measures and on the 2019 Index of Multiple Deprivation. In total, 225 wards were identified using this measure. The map behind me shows the areas identified as left behind. It's quite a small map, so you might not be able to zoom into the detail, but just to kind of give you a summary, there are large clusters around some of the former mining and industrial areas of the North East, particularly around County Durham and Teesside, in the North Midlands and South Yorkshire coalfield areas, in a lot of peripheral housing estates around some of the bigger urban conurbations of the North and Midlands, including around Greater Manchester, Merseyside and the West Midlands, and in the Thames Gateway area of North Kent and South Essex to the east of London. Having established where the areas were, we wanted to look at some of the kind of socioeconomic impacts of living in those areas. And the research identified that left behind areas have different challenges to other similarly deprived areas which aren't lacking in social infrastructure. Deprived areas with high community need tended to have fewer economic opportunities, poorer health outcomes and lower skills, which were reflected in high and rising levels of unemployment. That we also found a lower general resilience to some of the social and economic shocks that have occurred over the last 10 to 15 years. And that was largely down to lacking some of the community and civic resources to mitigate some of the worst of the impacts of some of those challenges. Our research is fed into the evidence base for the all-party parliamentary group for left behind neighbourhoods, which has been established with the aim of improving social and economic outcomes for residents in communities that suffer from this combination of economic deprivation, as well as poor connectivity and low levels of community engagement and lack of community spaces and places. And we've developed a series of deep data dives which explore the performance of left behind neighbourhoods on key topics, including health outcomes, connectivity, livability, the economy and labour markets, and the impacts of the pandemic. And what these data dives have consistently shown is that left behind neighbourhoods are falling further behind other similarly deprived areas on key outcomes. We're also working with the APPG to look at left behind neighbourhood performance on some of the key metrics for measuring progress in the levelling white paper under the 12 missions, and to assess the extent to which the white paper's policy programme aligns with the needs and aspirations of people living in left behind neighbourhoods. I've posted a link to the research outputs at the top of this slide if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about what we've been doing there. However, it's also important to state that the research is very much a work in progress, and what we're now looking to do is to review and update the Community Needs Index. So the overarching aim of this update is to provide a refined model which makes best use of up-to-date evidence to reflect profound social changes experienced over the last couple of years, particularly in the context of the global pandemic and the cost of living crisis. We also want to consult more widely to bring in the expertise of key stakeholders to peer review the methodology and ensure that the index meets the needs of the user community. This consultation will consider revising the units of geography for analysis, and we're actually recommending replacing wards, which the previous index was published at, with MSOA geographies in future iterations of the index in order to increase stability and ensure we're comparing across similarly sized neighbourhoods. We've also proposed updates to existing indicators and suggestions additional indicators for inclusion. And we are planning to review some of the methods for weighting, standardising and combining indicators and domains, including introducing more sensitivity testing to see the impacts of changing the weightings. And we're considering how best to combine the Community Needs Index with the indices of deprivation, and also the benefits of combining with other key frameworks to identify disadvantaged communities in the context of the Levelling Up agenda. And if you want to find out a little bit more about the research and input into this consultation, I've got again a handy link on this slide, which hopefully the slides will be shared around after the presentations. So I hope I've managed to stick to 10 minutes. It's been a bit whistle stop, but I'm now going to pass the baton back to Richard to pass on to the next set of speakers. Stop sharing my screen.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Stefan. And yes, just there we go. Audience appreciation. Well, I heard a shout from the crowd, which I was just about to say, actually, whenever I come to a conference like this, and you see a fantastic slide deck like that, the first question you say is, will they be circulated afterwards? The answer is yes, they will be, so you can expect to receive those. Now, it's still online. We're going to turn to Donna and Emma to tell us about the latest on subnational data, both what's available now and what's coming soon, and how we can use this to understand the link between deprivation and economic performance. So, Donna, I think you're going to lead the presentation, aren't you?
Right, so I think Emma's going to run the presentation and I will talk to the slides. So Emma, if you can just bring up the slides now. And just to introduce myself, so I'm Donna Leong. I'm the Director of Economic Statistics Change, which means that I'm in charge of statistics transformation, the ONS, but I also am the Director for Emma's team, the Subnational Statistics and Analysis team, who are responsible for all the excellent work that you see here. Okay. Perhaps next slide, please, Emma. So just to note, at ONS, we obviously provide subnational data analysis covering quite a wide range of topics. And I think in particular, I'll point you to the data that was recently produced on small area data on economic output, published down to MSOA levels, but data is available at GBA at SOA levels as part of the Secure Research Service. And we've also had a range of releases exploring towns data. In particular, I think the concept of towns as opposed to perhaps local authorities or other boundaries, reflecting the real geography on the ground. And then just to note that we've also produced, I think, quite innovatively scholarly telling outputs, which look at both productivity and income deprivation data and take into account the geography of place as well. And all of this data is helping us to build up a picture of places across the UK and inform some of the work, for example, that Stefan is doing around what constitutes left behind places, and hopefully as a useful source of information for different ways of looking at the subnational picture in the UK. Next slide, please, Emma. So just to give an example, this is taken from our scholarly telling article, which is if you want scholarly telling is you literally scroll down the screen, pictures come up with a narrative alongside. And in this particular case, it's concentrated on the distribution of income deprivation around neighbourhoods. And if you focus here on the yellow areas highlighted, these show areas where many neighbourhoods, there are only a small number that are more deprived and a greater number that are less deprived. So these are what we might call that well-off, relatively well-off bits of the UK. And then move to the next slide, please, Emma. And then to give you an example here, we have two other examples, one where you have sort of what we call an N-shaped profile, where most of the neighbourhoods are what we might on average, versus on the right-hand side, more income deprived, and what we might think of traditionally as the poorer areas. And you can see that there's obviously quite a lot of distribution here. And I think one of the factors I think that we might look at, and lots of deprivation right next to areas where there is more deprivation. Okay, so moving on now, I think one of the things mentioned by Richard at the beginning was that link between social deprivation and economic outcomes. And here, as we know, there isn't always a direct link, but what we've done here is we've pulled out, using our towns data, looking at areas which have higher productivity and low productivity, and then comparing income deprivation. As you can see, if you are a higher productivity town, you are less likely to have high income deprivation versus low productivity towns, which 67% of low productivity towns on this basis had high levels of neighbourhood income deprivation. Next slide, please, Emma. So here's another way of thinking about socioeconomic change, and that's changing demographics. I think we were talking in the green room before this around census coming through, so that will add another data point here. But as you can see, what we see is in some of those small towns and villages has been due to population growth, has been due to an increase in the number of over 65s, whereas cities have seen higher population growth of 16 to 24-year-olds. So there are obviously, a sort of pattern there in terms of metropolitan areas attracting younger, more productive members of the labour force. Next slide, please. This is, I think, this is taken from the publication on towns, looking at spatial analysis. And here, it's slightly fuzzy. I hope people can see what we've identified here is areas which had above average growth and employment versus areas which had declining employment. And what you can see is Manchester did have above average employment growth, and it appeared to have a bit of a spillover effect. You can see areas that were close to Manchester towns also saw above average employment growth compared, and this, just to note, this is for England and Wales, whereas perhaps more far-flung areas saw declining employment. So next slide, please. And lastly, here, the towns analysis also made a distinction between what we called, working towns and residential towns, where you saw towns which had predominantly people there who were not participating in the labour force. And these might be, for example, some of the coastal towns, I think, that Stefan identified in his earlier presentation. And what we can see is that that pattern around employment growth is also reflected here with what we call low deprivation areas in working towns having higher employment growth, and higher deprivation residential towns having declining employment growth. So this is, as I say, if people would like to go and look at some of the surrounding analysis, and that's this comes from the towns analysis that Emma's team have undertaken. Okay, so next slide. Hopefully people have seen this before. This is from the Levelling Up white paper, which just notes all the different ways in which we can think about levelling up and those connections. And what we see, and ONS, our job is to provide the data and evidence around these, and obviously to think about whether it is possible to draw from the analysis some of those connections and correlations. So last slide, please, Emma. So as part of, alongside the Levelling Up white paper, we also produced a subnational data strategy, which set out our vision to enhance production and dissemination of subnational data and statistics. We recognise this is obviously a question not just perhaps for this particular year, but also I think for decades to come, as we work through the impact not only of the pandemic, but before that, Brexit, and I think that will have further knock-on effects, I think, to that sort of pattern of deindustrialisation and so forth that I think Stefan highlighted as well. And we're publishing a work plan to support that on 16th of May, so do advise people to go and have a look and see what is forthcoming. Alongside Levelling Up paper, we also published this tool which enabled you to compare local authority areas, and here we compare Manchester, Stockport and Rochdale across a range of different indicators, looking at both how they compare both to the median and identifying whether there are any particular indicators where local authority areas rank as either positive or negative relative to the median. And we're hoping that we will expand upon that, and as that picture evolves around what constitutes a suitable metric for thinking about levelling up, and in particular I think those left behind, continue to build upon that tool. But I think invite people to go and have a play with that, and give us any feedback that you have, because it's very much an evolving picture. Obviously every statistic has potentially a subnational component, but some of those are easier to access than others, and so we very much want to understand what it is that local leaders need in order to make the decisions to benefit their citizens. I think one of the things we haven't covered here is public sector finances, but I think that's also, I think, an area where I think it's useful to think about both the inputs in terms of public services and the injection of funds, and then as well as what the outcomes that people are looking at. And then as lastly, just a plug, I think expectation of the census 2021, we're likely hoping to see early outputs from that in the very near future. I think June is touted as a date, and we expect to see that, and I'm sure that will give us a really interesting picture of the UK, or at least England and Wales, during what was a very unusual period in our history. So I'll stop there, and if Emma, if you want to add anything else to the presentation.
I don't think there's anything hugely more to add, but just to invite feedback on all of the products and things we've put out recently, because we are shaping a growing effort in this area at the moment. So we really welcome, a better understanding of what local areas would like to see from us.
Thanks, Donna, and thanks, Emma, and please, yes. And thanks for another great presentation. Personally, as an analyst myself, I'm just dying to get my hands on the census data, which you're going to have a much more flexible way of analysing at a really low level compared to the last census data. And if you haven't explored the Subnational data Explorer that Donna was presenting there, do go and see that, because it's absolutely fantastic. Now, last but by no means least, we're going to turn to Sarah to talk to us. So don't worry, I'm not expecting you to go into the weeds of what we've had there, because there's been such a rich feast of data presented. I was hoping you might say something more general about how the government might use this sort of data and this approach to data to shape policy on civil society in general and on levelling up in particular.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everybody. No slides from me, so apologies to the data geeks that love charts and things. So it's brilliant to see lots of faces that I know here today, and I suppose this feels like part of a continuous dialogue about how government and communities and civil society and lots of other parts of the ecosystem can work together. The bit of the world that I'm responsible for is the Community Spaces and Relationships strategy. And in fact, I'm jointly responsible for it because we are delivering it jointly between DCMS and DLUC. And I'll reflect a bit later on what that means for how we're approaching this. But we're so delighted to be working on it. And I suppose I just wanted to reflect a bit today about the role of evidence in the work that we're doing. I think it's fair to say that there's tons of data, but there isn't a single piece of evidence that is a silver bullet that is going to tell us how to level up communities, and specifically in our bit of the world around increasing social cohesion and social infrastructure. We have commissioned Frontier Economics to undertake a rapid review of the evidence that is there, and it brings together definitions, concepts, and sets out the commonalities and links between them. And I suppose the pieces that I find to be very significant are the absolute clarity that local context is vitally important, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, which obviously the data we've just heard speaks to. And really strong evidence that there are many factors that will need to work together simultaneously to make change happen. And specifically thinking about delivering community infrastructure, all of the different actors, volunteers, charismatic leaders, accessibility, location, external funding, local government, paid staff, and so on. So there's lots of really strong evidence about the fact that this is a kind of complicated network that is obviously place-specific. And there's lots of strong evidence about the factors that are common to community initiatives that enhance social capital. So inclusivity, obviously, and projects that foster interaction, raising awareness of opportunities for networks to form, and institutions that kind of lead activities and kind of invite people to participate. And I suppose the reason that I'm drawn to those is that the kind of common theme is this is really complicated and it's nuanced, and we aren't going to get to a single prescription for change. And indeed, when you go deeper into the evidence, it's also true that there are tensions between it, that there isn't, we talk to lots of organisations every week, and everyone has a slightly different take on it. And so part of our job is to synthesise that. There are areas that I'm really keen to deepen our knowledge on. So I'm keen to understand in a given place what enabled success or what the barriers were, and specifically the interplay between factors. So we've got lots of research about one particular place or one particular variable, but it's the interplay between them, that ecosystem. Lots of the studies that we've engaged with are about individual interventions rather than kind of looking more widely. So again, it's kind of stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. I'm really interested in understanding how community members experience community infrastructure, and in particular, how to increase the kind of diversity of participation, and that's something that we're thinking about a lot. And I'm interested in understanding the ecosystem that bolsters the effectiveness of planning, of delivery, and so on. So in all cases, for us, it's about stepping back and understanding the bigger picture. I'm also really interested in whether behavioural insights have got a role in encouraging participation and making change feel possible, and really want to develop our thinking on that. And I suppose the other thing to say, of course, is the relationship between community spaces and relationships and the rest of the levelling up story. And not just the relationship, but is there a kind of causal link between improving social infrastructure and what that means for other pieces that Andy was talking about earlier. I thought it might be just helpful to reflect on how we're addressing the evidence and our plans for delivery. But I need to be sort of reasonably careful because our plans are with ministers at the moment, so I can share the direction of travel. So just to reflect on the DCMS DLUC joint team, we've got a fantastic and highly engaged team, many of whom are at the back of the room and delighted to talk to you. And whilst it's completely reasonable for no one outside of government to, frankly, give a monkey's who's delivering it, I suppose what I wanted to say about that is it's about going beyond silos or a single view of how to solve this problem and stepping back and recognising, that this is about lots of different groups in a given area working together to make change happen. And so I think the joint team represents that and is really important. And because the focus absolutely has to be on communities and change, the team is really looking forward to getting out on the road and going into communities and really listening hard and understanding the opportunities, the barriers, what's really happening, rather than sort of sitting in a room in Whitehall buried in lots of papers. So we're really keen to understand how to support communities, how to put them in the driving seat. There's strong evidence, isn't there, that in a given place, a person taking responsibility for having a longer-term view of an infrastructure is a driver of success. And that can be about holding that longer-term vision. It can be about long-term, funding and income. It can be about succession planning. It can be about ensuring the longevity of community infrastructure. And I suppose I just wanted to say that I think about the strategy in the same way. We are responsible for holding on to that longer-term vision and for delivering a strategy that has it at its heart. And so coming back to the evidence, what does that mean for the evidence and for our strategy? No one in our team is looking to replicate the evidence that already exists and to just do it slightly differently this time. We're keen to bring it together, to synthesize it, to understand where the gaps are, but to build a long-term piece of work that is continuously iterating, continuously learning, so that we can kind of build towards that long-term vision rather than waiting for perfect evidence before we can get anything done. In my view, that's a kind of precondition of success. So I think we are talking about a kind of a bold leap here. We've got lots of knowledge, and really success will be building on what we know, but a kind of a long-term strategy where we're continuously learning, we're continually getting better data, and working that into this project.
Sarah, thank you very much.
No trouble.
Well, so we've had 3 fantastic presentations. We've heard about the evolving Community Needs Index, the evolving subnational data, and the evolving strategy for community spaces and relationships. Now, we haven't got much time left because we're running a little bit late for questions, but I really do want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. So if you've got a question, then please raise your hand now. We've got the roving mics. A request from me, a couple of things. Please mention your name, and if you're from an organisation, the name of the organisation. Please make sure your question is short and actually involves a question and not a statement. We'll go over to that far side.
Hi, John Hutchinson, Director from Groundwork. I will start with a statement because I think it frames the question quite well. Throughout today, all we've seen is the evidence for investment in community at the local level creates change. that is through generations of policy that have changed but tried to deliver the same thing. So my question is 2 points. One, where does this investment come from? And two, how do we make sure that that investment gets to the hyper-local level where it can actually make change?
Fantastic, thank you very much. And we'll take the question over here as well.
Thank you. Tom Chance from the Community Land Trust Network. I want to ask about the expansiveness of our understanding of civic spaces, community spaces, which is mainly perhaps for a colleague from DCMS. DLUC last year published some research that community-led approaches to housing tackle loneliness and social cohesion, not only in the people who live in the homes, but in the wider community as well. And we heard earlier from Peter Tyler about mainstream services. So the Oxy analysis, it'd be interesting to look at what mainstream services already exist in those communities that could be adapted through models of partnership with local community to begin to build that. I wonder if that's something you've considered, or is there any evidence or data to begin to unpick that?
Thank you very much, Tom. Now, I hope you were able to hear those questions online as well. They seem primarily for you, sir. If that's...
I don't have a magic money tree. That's definitely clear. The white paper did announce some money, so obviously UK SPF, collaboration between lottery providers, and kind of pieces on leveraging private investment. I think the piece that everyone's really interested in is dormant assets. And as you'll know, there's a consultation in the summer about what it should be used for. It carries all of the usual caveats about additionality and so on, but a community wealth fund is part of the consultation. And so the first and obvious thing to say is to participate in the consultation and share views. The second thing to say is that the strategy is kind of step one, right? It's about setting a vision for government's ambition and a kind of a roadmap or a plan to deliver that. And part of that conversation will then be, the art of the possible. So I can't speak for Treasury, and that won't surprise you that that's the case, but there are both opportunities for people to share their views on how dormant assets should be used, and obviously, in order to create a strategy with a vision, conversations about funding will be happening.
Thanks, Sarah. And there are colleagues from the Treasury in the room, so if you do want to have a conversation with them over coffee, I'm sure they'll be more than happy to engage you in that discussion. Now, we've got a question that's come in online from from Rebecca Magden at the University of Glasgow. Could the speakers talk to what kinds of qualitative data have helped, or they could see help, shape decision-making at either the local or the national level? Donna, do you want to have a first go at that? What sorts of qualitative data could help?
So I thought I would just come in there at that point and take an opportunity in my last 5 minutes to plug an initiative that ONS have been funded by DLUC to do, which is to provide dedicated resource from ONS to local decision makers across the UK. So we're calling this ONS Local, and we hope very soon to come along and talk to people within your area to think about precisely to answer this question, what sort of quantitative data are you looking for? What would you find most useful? Where do you think the current gaps are? And also to provide help in navigating, I think, the wealth of data that is available within ONS for questions of the day. So I thought I'd just come in here and make that plug. And if anyone is interested, please contact Emma. And we're hoping to launch this initiative really soon.
Great, thank you very much, Donna. I'm conscious of time. I don't want to keep you away from your coffee and tea, so thank you very much. It's time, I guess, to draw things to a close. It has been a rich discussion, lots of great presentations, lots of new information. I hope it inspires you to have even deeper conversations in the breakout sessions that we're going to have after the refreshment break. That question we just had about qualitative and quantitative data is something that at the Institute for Community Studies we take very seriously, because obviously there is a need for both, and it's a question of balance. You need to have both quantitative data and qualitative insights to understand what's really going on in communities. If you'd like to find out more about the latest research in this area, do visit the Institute for Community Studies repository at icstudies.org.uk/repository, where you'll find over 360 research reports, case studies, data sets and other publications, including the research we've been talking about today and other research produced by our partners, Local Trust, and also by Power to Change. All that remains for me to do now is to thank you very much and to ask you to join me in thanking our panellists for their time this afternoon.